The sound of expensive silverware hitting porcelain echoed through the private dining room of the Wellington Club in downtown Chicago. 7 men in tailored suits sat around a mahogany table, their laughter bouncing off walls adorned with oil paintings worth more than most people earn in a decade. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled like a jewel box, indifferent to the arrogance unfolding inside. Gerald Morrison, CEO of Morrison Capital Partners, wiped tears from his eyes as he finished recounting a story. His Rolex caught the chandelier light as he gestured dramatically toward the window. The men around him continued to chuckle, their wine glasses half empty, their bellies full of prime rib and their heads full of superiority. The source of their amusement stood 3 floors below on the street corner. A group of motorcycles had pulled up to the traffic light. The riders wore leather vests covered in patches, their bikes rumbling like distant thunder. From the vantage point of the private dining room, they looked like ants, dangerous, amusing ants. "Look at them," Gerald said, pointing. "The dregs of society pretending they matter, probably never held a real job in their lives." Richard Bellamy, chief financial officer of a pharmaceutical conglomerate, leaned forward to get a better look. His silk tie cost more than some of those motorcycles. "My father used to say that men who ride motorcycles are compensating for something, usually intelligence." The table erupted in laughter again. Someone refilled the wine glasses. The bikers below had no idea they were being observed, being mocked by men who measured human worth in stock portfolios and country club memberships. "I heard they have their little meetings at some dive bar across town," added Marcus Webb, a real estate developer who had recently evicted an entire apartment building to make room for luxury condominiums. "Probably planning their next tattoo party." More laughter. The private room felt hermetically sealed from the real world, a bubble of privilege where consequences seemed as foreign as manual labor. But fate has a peculiar sense of timing, and sometimes the universe arranges its pieces in ways that shatter bubbles with devastating precision. The dinner continued for another hour. Cigars were lit. Brandy was poured. Business deals were discussed in the casual way that only men of extreme wealth discuss them, as if moving millions of dollars was no more significant than choosing between appetizers. At 9:47 that evening, Gerald Morrison received a phone call that would change everything. His personal assistant's voice trembled on the other end of the line. Gerald's face transformed from smug satisfaction to pale shock in the span of 3 sentences. The cigar fell from his fingers, leaving a small burn on the antique tablecloth. "What is it?" Richard asked, noticing his friend's expression. Gerald could not speak. His hand shook as he lowered the phone. The other men fell silent, sensing that something had fundamentally shifted in the room's atmosphere. "My daughter," Gerald finally managed. "Emma. There was an accident on Highway 47. She was driving home from her college. A drunk driver. They are taking her to Memorial General right now." The room transformed instantly. The laughter of minutes ago seemed obscene now, a distant memory from a different lifetime. Gerald stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. His hands searched his pockets for car keys, but his fingers had forgotten how to function. "I will drive you," Richard offered, standing. But Gerald was already moving toward the door, his mind filled with images of his 20-year-old daughter, her smile, her voice, the last conversation they had shared 3 days ago when she called to tell him about her upcoming graduation. He had been distracted during that call, checking emails, barely listening. Now those emails seemed like the most meaningless collection of words ever assembled. The men gathered their things in hurried silence. The waiter who came to present the check was waved away. In moments, the private dining room stood empty, the half-finished brandy and extinguished cigars the only evidence of the evening's earlier frivolity. Outside, the night air hit Gerald's face like a slap. The street that had seemed so distant from the private room now felt oppressively real. Headlights blurred past. Sounds seemed amplified and distorted. His driver was nowhere to be found. Gerald Morrison, a man who controlled billions of dollars, who sat on the boards of 12 corporations, who had been featured on the cover of Forbes twice, stood on a Chicago sidewalk unable to remember how to hail a taxi. His empire of power crumbled in the face of a father's terror. Richard guided him toward the parking garage. The other businessmen dispersed to their own vehicles, some heading home, others promising to meet at the hospital. The brotherhood of the boardroom, such as it was, mobilized in the only way it knew how. But the roads that night had other plans. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you believe that true strength reveals itself not in wealth but in character, and that the most powerful moments come when strangers become guardians, then subscribe now. This story is just beginning, and what happens next will remind you why humanity still has hope. The route from downtown Chicago to Memorial General Hospital typically took 22 minutes. That night, it would take much longer, and the detour would lead Gerald Morrison through an experience that would reshape his understanding of the world and his place in it. Richard Bellamy drove his Mercedes through the night streets with controlled urgency. Gerald sat in the passenger seat, his phone pressed to his ear, trying to reach anyone who could give him information about his daughter's condition. The calls went to voicemail. The hospital line was busy. Each unanswered ring felt like a small death. "The highway is backed up," Richard said, checking his navigation system. "There must be construction. I am going to take the surface streets through Riverside." Gerald nodded without really hearing. His mind was 300 miles away, replaying every moment he had missed in Emma's life. The dance recitals he had skipped for board meetings, the birthdays celebrated via video call from hotel rooms in foreign cities, the graduation he had almost missed because of a merger negotiation. He had always told himself that his success was for his family, that the money, the power, the prestige would give Emma opportunities he never had. But sitting in that leather seat, watching unfamiliar streets pass by, Gerald Morrison began to suspect he had been lying to himself for 20 years. The Mercedes turned onto a street Gerald did not recognize. The neighborhood was different from the gleaming downtown towers. Here, the buildings were older, worn but dignified. Small businesses lined the street, a hardware store, a bakery that had probably been family-owned for generations, a bar called the Iron Saddle with motorcycles parked outside. Gerald barely noticed any of it. His world had contracted to the size of his daughter's face, the sound of her laughter, the fear of never hearing it again. Then the car sputtered. Once. Twice. The engine coughed like a sick animal and died. Richard pulled to the curb, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration. He turned the key. Nothing. Again. Nothing. "This is impossible," Richard said. "This car was serviced last week. It has never given me any trouble." Gerald stared at him with wild eyes. "We have to get to the hospital. My daughter is there. She could be dying." Richard pulled out his phone to call for a car service. No signal. He tried again. The screen showed full bars, but every call failed to connect. Gerald fumbled with his own phone. Same result. Calls would not go through. Messages would not send. It was as if the universe had conspired to isolate them in this unfamiliar neighborhood on this critical night. "We will walk," Gerald said, opening his car door. "We will find a payphone or flag down another car. Something. We cannot just sit here." The two men stepped onto the sidewalk. The street was quiet except for muffled music coming from the Iron Saddle bar. Gerald looked both directions, searching for anyone who might help. The only souls visible were the shadows moving behind the bar's frosted windows and the motorcycles gleaming under the streetlight. Those motorcycles. Gerald recognized them, the same ones they had mocked from the private dining room just hours ago. The same leather vests and patches, the same rumbling engines that had seemed so contemptible from the height of privilege. Richard noticed them too. Maybe we should try another direction. Those people might not be helpful. But Gerald Morrison was beyond caring about social distinctions. His daughter was in a hospital bed somewhere. His carefully constructed world had crumbled. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He pushed open the door to the Iron Saddle and stepped inside. The bar fell silent as the two men in expensive suits entered. It was the kind of silence that settles over a room when something unexpected disrupts its equilibrium. Every eye turned toward Gerald and Richard. Faces weathered by roads and years studied the newcomers with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. The interior of the Iron Saddle was nothing like the establishments Gerald frequented. No sommelier, no white tablecloths, no staff in formal attire. Instead, there was a long wooden bar, pool tables in the back, walls covered with photographs and memorabilia from decades of motorcycle journeys, and people who looked like they had earned every line on their faces through actual living. Gerald scanned the room, his desperation overriding his discomfort. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "I need help. My daughter was in an accident. I need to get to Memorial General Hospital and my car broke down and my phone is not working." A large man with a gray beard and arms covered in tattoos set down his beer. He wore a leather vest with patches that identified him as the president of a motorcycle club called the Iron Brotherhood. His name, stitched above his heart, was Samuel Ironside Johnson. Samuel studied Gerald for a long moment. He saw the expensive suit, the Rolex, the air of privilege that clung to the man even in his distress. He also saw something else. He saw a father, a terrified father whose child was hurt. And that recognition activated something deep in Samuel's chest, something that transcended social boundaries and economic divisions. "Memorial General," Samuel repeated. "That is about 15 minutes from here." Gerald nodded frantically. "Please, I will pay anything. I just need to get there." Samuel turned to look at the men and women gathered around him. These were his brothers and sisters of the road, mechanics and veterans, teachers and construction workers, people who had found family not through blood, but through shared values and mutual respect. They had ridden through storms together, buried friends together, celebrated triumphs together. They had also been mocked by men like Gerald Morrison countless times, called criminals, called lowlifes, called the dregs of society. Every one of them had felt the sting of judgment from people who had never taken the time to look beneath the leather. But the Iron Brotherhood had a code, and that code did not make exceptions based on personal grievance. Samuel stood up from his bar stool. At 6 feet 4 inches, he towered over Gerald. His presence filled the room. "Your money is no good here," Samuel said, "but your daughter needs you, so we ride." He turned to face the room. Without a word, more than a dozen men and women began moving toward the door. Helmets were grabbed from hooks on the wall. Leather jackets were pulled on. Keys appeared in hands. Gerald stood frozen, unsure what was happening. A woman named Maria, who wore her silver hair in a long braid and had the calm demeanor of someone who had seen everything life could offer, approached him. "You ever ride before?" she asked. Gerald shook his head. Maria handed him a helmet. "You are going to ride with me. Hold on tight. Do not lean against my turns, and try to breathe." Outside, the motorcycles roared to life. The sound that had seemed so offensive from the private dining room now filled Gerald with something unexpected. Hope. Richard stood on the sidewalk, watching in disbelief as his friend climbed onto the back of a motorcycle, driven by a silver-haired woman old enough to be his mother. "There is room for you too," Samuel called to Richard. "Jake has a passenger seat." Richard hesitated. Every instinct cultivated over decades of corporate life told him this was wrong. These people were strangers, probably dangerous, certainly beneath him. But he thought of Gerald. He thought of Emma, a young woman he had watched grow up at company events and holiday parties. And he thought of how small his objections suddenly seemed. He climbed onto the back of Jake's motorcycle. The convoy pulled onto the street. 14 motorcycles moving in formation through the night, carrying 2 terrified men in suits toward a hospital where a young woman fought for her life. Traffic parted before them. The sound of their engines announced their approach. People on sidewalks stopped to watch. Some assumed they were witnessing something dangerous. Others sensed something different, something purposeful in the way the riders moved. Samuel led the formation with the precision of someone who had led convoys in Afghanistan 20 years earlier. He knew these streets. He knew the shortcuts. He knew how to move a group through a city with efficiency and safety. 12 minutes after leaving the Iron Saddle, the motorcycles pulled into the emergency entrance of Memorial General Hospital. Gerald dismounted before Maria had fully stopped, nearly falling in his haste. He ran toward the entrance without looking back, driven by the singular need to reach his daughter. Richard followed, pausing briefly to nod at Jake in acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. The motorcycles remained in the parking lot, their engines cooling, their riders gathered in a loose circle. They did not expect thanks. They did not require it. They had simply done what their code demanded. They had helped someone in need. But the night was not over. And what happened inside that hospital would bring Gerald Morrison back to that parking lot before dawn, a changed man. Inside Memorial General, Gerald pushed through the emergency room doors with the force of desperation. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the antiseptic smell too sharp. Everything felt hyper-real, as if his senses had been stripped of their normal filters. A nurse at the intake desk looked up as he approached. "My daughter," Gerald said, breathless. "Emma Morrison. She was in a car accident. They brought her here." The nurse checked her computer. Her expression remained professionally neutral, revealing nothing. "One moment, sir. Let me find out her status." Gerald waited. Each second stretched into eternity. Richard arrived beside him, equally winded from their rush through the hospital corridors. A doctor emerged from behind a set of swinging doors. She was young, probably in her early 30s, with the tired eyes of someone nearing the end of a long shift. Her name tag read, Dr. Sarah Chen. "Mr. Morrison?" she asked. Gerald stepped forward. "Yes, that is me. Where is my daughter? Is she okay?" Dr. Chen gestured toward a quiet corner of the waiting area. "Let me explain the situation." They sat in plastic chairs that seemed designed to prevent comfort. The waiting room held a handful of other worried families, each absorbed in their own private crises. "Emma was in a serious collision," Dr. Chen began. "Her car was struck by another vehicle that crossed the median. She has multiple injuries, including broken ribs and internal contusions. She is in surgery right now." Gerald felt the floor shift beneath him. "Surgery? Is she going to be okay?" Dr. Chen's expression remained carefully composed. "The surgical team is excellent. They are doing everything possible. But I need to prepare you, Mr. Morrison. The next few hours are critical. We will not know the full extent of her injuries until the surgery is complete." Gerald nodded, though he barely processed the words. His mind kept returning to the image of Emma as a child, holding his hand at the zoo, asking why the giraffes had such long necks. He had not known the answer then. He did not know any answers now. Richard stayed with him through the waiting. Other executives from the dinner arrived over the next hour, their presence a show of support that felt both appreciated and hollow. What good were their billions now? What good were their mergers and acquisitions and quarterly reports? At 2 a.m, Gerald stepped outside to breathe. The emergency room had become suffocating, the weight of fear pressing down on his chest like a physical force. The motorcycles were still there. Gerald stopped in his tracks. The riders of the Iron Brotherhood sat on benches near the entrance, drinking coffee from vending machine cups, speaking quietly among themselves. They had been there for hours, waiting. Samuel noticed Gerald and stood. He walked over with the unhurried gait of someone who had learned patience through hard experience. "How is she?" Samuel asked. Gerald was stunned. "You are still here, all of you. Why?" Samuel shrugged. "Because you are here, and nobody should face something like this alone." Gerald looked at the group of bikers, men and women who had never met his daughter. People he had mocked just hours ago from his position of perceived superiority. They had given up their evening to help a stranger, and then stayed through the night to offer silent support. Something broke inside Gerald Morrison. Not his spirit. Something else. Something harder. The shell of certainty he had built around himself over decades of success. The belief that his way of seeing the world was the only valid perspective. The assumption that worth could be measured in dollars and status. Tears began to fall down his face. He did not try to hide them. Samuel placed a hand on Gerald's shoulder. The gesture was simple, human, without pretense or expectation. "Tell us about her," Samuel said. "Your daughter. What is she like?" And standing in a hospital parking lot at 2 a.m, surrounded by people he would have dismissed as beneath him just hours earlier, Gerald Morrison began to talk about his daughter. Her kindness, her intelligence, her dream of becoming a veterinarian, her habit of adopting stray animals and finding them homes, her laughter that could fill a room, her patience with her workaholic father who missed so many moments. The bikers listened. They asked questions. They shared stories of their own children, their own fears, their own hopes. The conversation flowed without hierarchy, without judgment, without the invisible barriers that normally divided their worlds. At 4:17 in the morning, Dr. Chen emerged from the hospital to find Gerald surrounded by leather-clad strangers who had become something more. She delivered news that made Gerald collapse with relief. Emma had survived the surgery. Her condition was stable. The road to recovery would be long, but she was expected to make a full return to health. Gerald wept openly. The bikers cheered. Richard, who had been pacing nearby, sank into a bench as the tension drained from his body. And in that moment, in the gray light before dawn, something shifted in the universe. A connection formed between worlds that rarely intersected. A bridge built from kindness and crisis. If this story is touching something inside you, if you feel the tears forming or your heart opening, pause right now and leave a comment saying, "Real strength has no uniform." Let everyone in this community know that you understand what true power really means. Your comment tells me you are one of the ones who truly sees. The sun rose over Chicago, painting the hospital in shades of gold and orange. Gerald had not slept. He had spent the night hours moving between Emma's bedside and the parking lot where the Iron Brotherhood maintained their vigil. Emma had briefly regained consciousness around 6 a.m. Her eyes had found her father's face, and she had managed a weak smile before the medication pulled her back under. "Dad," she had whispered. "You came." "I will always come," Gerald had replied, gripping her hand. "Always." Outside, the bikers prepared to leave. They had jobs to get to. Families waiting at home. Lives that continued regardless of the drama they had witnessed. Gerald caught Samuel before he mounted his motorcycle. "I do not know how to thank you," Gerald said. "What you did last night, staying all these hours. I cannot explain what it meant." Samuel studied the businessman. He saw something different in Gerald's eyes now. The arrogance had been replaced by something humbler, something more human. "You do not need to thank us," Samuel said. "We did what anyone should do. The problem is not many do." Gerald nodded. "Can I ask you something? Why? Why help me? You do not know me. I am not part of your world." Samuel smiled, the expression that transformed his weathered face. "See, that is where you are wrong. There is only one world. We just build walls inside it and pretend they are real. Last night your wall came down. That is all." He mounted his motorcycle and started the engine. The other riders did the same. The parking lot filled with the thunder of machines preparing to depart. Maria pulled up beside Gerald. "Your daughter is lucky to have a father who loves her so much," she said. "Make sure she knows it every day. Time is the only currency that matters in the end." The convoy pulled out of the hospital parking lot, a parade of chrome and leather and humanity. Gerald watched until the last motorcycle disappeared around the corner. Then he turned and walked back inside to be with his daughter. The following weeks brought a series of transformations that rippled outward from that hospital room like stones dropped in still water. Emma's recovery progressed steadily. She faced setbacks and breakthroughs with the resilience of youth and the support of a father who had fundamentally reordered his priorities. Gerald worked from the hospital. He delegated responsibilities he had always insisted on handling personally. He discovered that Morrison Capital Partners could function without his constant oversight, a revelation that was both humbling and liberating. But the changes extended beyond Gerald's relationship with his daughter. 2 weeks after the accident, Gerald returned to the Iron Saddle. He walked through the door alone, without the expensive suit, wearing jeans and a plain shirt. The bar fell silent again, but this time the silence carried a different quality. Samuel looked up from his usual seat at the bar. Recognition crossed his face, followed by curiosity. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "was not expecting to see you here." Gerald approached the bar. "I wanted to talk, to thank you properly, and to ask some questions." Samuel gestured to the empty stool beside him. "Beer? Please." They sat together, an unlikely pair, as Gerald asked about the Iron Brotherhood. He learned that the club had been founded 30 years ago by a group of Vietnam veterans struggling to reintegrate into civilian society. They had found solace in the open road, in the brotherhood of shared experience, in the simple act of riding together. Over the decades, the club had evolved. They now organized charity rides for children's hospitals. They provided escorts for funerals of fallen soldiers. They ran a mentorship program for troubled youth, teaching motorcycle maintenance as a vehicle for life skills. The patches on their vests, which Gerald had dismissed as criminal insignia, actually represented years of service, charitable achievements, and bonds forged through mutual respect. "We are not perfect," Samuel admitted. "Nobody is. But we try to live by a code. Look out for each other. Help those in need. Leave places better than we found them." Gerald listened. He asked more questions. He began to understand that the world contained depths and dimensions he had been too busy and too proud to notice. Before he left that evening, Gerald made Samuel an offer. Not money. Something more meaningful. "The Morrison Foundation funds various causes," Gerald explained. "Children's education, medical research, veterans services. I would like to discuss how we might support the work your club does." Samuel considered the offer. "That is generous. But we do not operate that way. We do not accept charity." "It would not be charity," Gerald said. "It would be partnership. Your club has connections and credibility in communities my foundation could never reach directly. You know what people actually need, not what looks good in a press release." Samuel stroked his beard, thinking. "Let me talk to the brothers and sisters. We make decisions together. That is how it works." Gerald nodded. "I respect that. Here is my card. Call me when you are ready." He walked out into the night, leaving behind a roomful of bikers who were reconsidering their assumptions just as thoroughly as he had reconsidered his own. The story of what Gerald Morrison did next spread through Chicago's business community with the speed of scandal, but the substance of something far more meaningful. He proposed a new initiative at the next Morrison Foundation board meeting. Instead of the usual approach of writing checks to established nonprofits, the foundation would partner directly with community organizations like the Iron Brotherhood to identify and address needs at the ground level. The board members, most of whom had been at that fateful dinner, were skeptical. Richard Bellamy raised concerns about reputational risk. Marcus Webb questioned the scalability. Others worried about liability and accountability. Gerald listened to every objection. Then he told them the full story of that night. The breakdown, the bar, the ride through the city, the hours of waiting, the humanity he had witnessed from people he had spent his life dismissing. "We build walls," Gerald said, echoing Samuel's words. "We pretend they are real. We convince ourselves that our success makes us better, our wealth makes us worthy. But when everything fell apart, When my daughter's life hung in the balance, it was not my money or my position that helped me. It was strangers. Strangers we would have stepped over on the street. The room fell silent. I am not suggesting we abandon our standards or ignore practical concerns, Gerald continued. I am suggesting we expand our definition of who deserves a seat at the table. The Iron Brotherhood has been doing meaningful work in this city for 30 years. They have never asked for recognition or resources. They just show up day after day because it is right. Richard Bellamy spoke first. I was there that night. I rode on the back of a motorcycle driven by a man named Jake. He is a retired firefighter who spent 23 years running into burning buildings. He asked nothing from us, not even a thank you. Gerald is right. We have been building walls and calling them wisdom. The vote to approve the Community Partnership Initiative was unanimous. Over the following months, the unlikely alliance between Morrison Foundation and the Iron Brotherhood produced remarkable results. The mentorship program expanded to 3 additional neighborhoods. A scholarship fund was established for children of fallen first responders. A joint charitable ride raised over $2 million for pediatric cancer research. But the most significant outcome could not be measured in dollars or programs. Something shifted in how people perceived each other. Business executives attended motorcycle safety courses taught by Iron Brotherhood members. Bikers participated in financial literacy workshops offered by Foundation volunteers. Families from vastly different backgrounds found themselves at the same barbecues, their children playing together, their preconceptions dissolving in the ordinary magic of shared laughter and common ground. Emma Morrison made a full recovery. She returned to college that fall, completing her degree in veterinary science. At her graduation ceremony, she gave a speech about the night of her accident, about the strangers who helped her father reach the hospital, about the friendships that grew from crisis. In the audience sat Gerald Morrison, tears streaming down his face for the second time in a year, but this time from joy. Beside him sat Samuel Johnson, Maria, Jake, and a dozen other members of the Iron Brotherhood, wearing their leather vests proudly in the formal academic setting. After the ceremony, Emma approached Samuel with a small package wrapped in paper. "I made this for you," she said. "For all of you. I know it is not much, but I wanted you to have something to remember." Samuel unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a framed photograph. Emma had taken it the previous summer at a combined Foundation Brotherhood charity event. The image showed Gerald and Samuel standing side by side, their arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at some shared joke. Behind them, a group that included CEOs and mechanics, lawyers and construction workers, all mingled together in genuine fellowship. Below the photograph, Emma had written, "The only walls are the ones we build. Thank you for showing my dad how to tear us down." Samuel stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked up at the young woman standing before him, the daughter of a man who had once represented everything the bikers had learned to distrust. "We did not save you that night," Samuel said quietly. "We just gave your father a ride. But you might be onto something about the walls." He turned to show the photograph to Maria and the others. The gift was passed from hand to hand, each person studying the image, each recognizing the improbability and the power of what it represented. Gerald joined them, his arm around Emma's shoulders. "I owe you all more than I can ever repay," he said. Samuel shook his head. "You do not owe us anything. That is the whole point. That is what you wealthy types never seem to understand. Kindness is not a transaction. It is not an investment with expected returns. It is just something you do because the world needs it." Gerald smiled. "You know, a year ago, I would have argued with that. I would have said everything is a transaction. Everything has a price. But I have learned that some things transcend economics. Friendship, family, the willingness to help a stranger because it is right." "Sounds like you have been doing some thinking," Samuel said. "I have had good teachers." The afternoon continued with celebration and conversation. Boundaries that had once seemed permanent continued to erode in the warmth of mutual respect. As evening approached and the crowd began to disperse, Gerald found himself standing alone with Samuel in the university quadrangle. The setting sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. "What happens now?" Gerald asked. Samuel looked at the sky, considering the question. "Now we keep riding, keep showing up, keep helping where we can." "And the partnership, the foundation work? It will continue. But you should know something, Gerald. We never did any of this for your money or your foundation. We did it because it aligned with who we already are. The resources helped us do more of what we were always doing. That is the only reason it worked." Gerald nodded slowly. "I understand. The organization is just a vehicle. The values have to come first. Now you are getting it." They shook hands, two men from different worlds who had found unexpected common ground. As Samuel walked toward the parking lot where the motorcycles waited, Gerald called after him. "Same time next month? The charity planning meeting?" Samuel turned back with a grin. "Would not miss it. And Gerald, you might consider getting yourself a motorcycle. The open road has a way of clearing the head." Gerald laughed. "My wife would have me committed." "That is what they all say. Then they take their first real ride and everything changes." The motorcycles roared to life. The Iron Brotherhood pulled out of the university parking lot in formation, their engines a symphony of freedom and purpose. Gerald watched until they disappeared around the corner, just as he had watched from the hospital parking lot on that transformative night. But this time, he was not watching them leave. He was watching friends ride toward the horizon, knowing he would see them again, knowing their worlds had become permanently intertwined. If you watch this far, it is because this story touched something real inside you. It is because you believe that humanity is not defined by wealth or status or the clothes we wear, but by the choices we make when no one is watching. Leave a comment below saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and understand who really connects with these stories. Your engagement tells me that this community is growing, that more people are choosing to see beyond the walls we build. And if you felt something during this journey, if the story of Gerald and Samuel and Emma reminded you that kindness has no uniform and courage has no price tag, then do 3 things right now. First, subscribe to this channel. Every day we share stories that restore faith in humanity, stories that remind us we are all connected, stories that prove the world is better than the headlines suggest. Second, like this video. Your likes tell the algorithm to share these stories with more people who need to hear them. Every like is a vote for hope over cynicism. Third, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Send it to the friend who has given up on humanity. Post it for the family member who feels alone. Let these stories spread like ripples across still water, touching lives we will never know. The world Gerald Morrison built had seemed so solid, so permanent. Corner offices, private dining rooms, portfolios worth millions. He had measured his life in acquisitions and quarterly reports, convinced that success meant accumulation. But in one night, on one desperate ride through Chicago streets, everything he believed was revealed as fragile construction. The walls came down, the pretense dissolved, and in its place grew something far more valuable than anything money could buy: connection, community. The recognition that every human being carries dignity, regardless of their circumstances. Gerald Morrison still runs Morrison Capital Partners. He still makes deals and moves money and plays the games of high finance. But he does it differently now. He asks different questions. He notices different things. He remembers that the person across the negotiating table is someone's father or daughter or friend. Samuel Johnson still rides with the Iron Brotherhood, still organizes charity events and mentorship programs and funeral escorts, still lives by a code that values action over words and loyalty over convenience. Their worlds still look different on the surface. But beneath the leather and the silk, beneath the motorcycles and the Mercedes, they discovered a truth that transcends circumstance. We are all just people, trying to help each other through. Some ride motorcycles, some drive luxury cars, some wear suits, some wear vests covered in patches. But when crisis comes, when the walls fall, when we see each other clearly, we discover that the differences were never as real as we thought. In the end, Gerald Morrison learned something that his business school never taught him, something his mentors and colleagues and competitors never understood. True wealth is measured in relationships. True power is revealed in kindness. True success is found in the willingness to show up for strangers, expecting nothing in return. The businessmen had laughed at the biker gang. They had mocked them from their position of privilege, secure in their assumptions of superiority. But when the riders showed up uninvited, when they appeared exactly when they were needed most, the laughter died and something better took its place. Respect, gratitude, humility, connection. These are the currencies that never depreciate. These are the investments that always pay dividends. These are the only measures of a life well lived. Emma Morrison graduated with honors. She now runs a veterinary clinic that offers sliding scale fees for families in need. Above her desk hangs a photograph of her father standing with Samuel Johnson, two men from different worlds, united by a night that changed everything. She tells the story often, to patients, to colleagues, to anyone who will listen. It is a simple story, really. A breakdown on an unfamiliar street, a bar full of strangers, a ride through the night, hours of waiting in a hospital parking lot. But simple stories sometimes carry the deepest truths. We build walls. We pretend they are real. Then something happens. A crisis, an accident, a moment of vulnerability. And we discover that the walls were always an illusion, that humanity is not divided into categories of worthy and unworthy, that the rough-looking stranger might be the one who saves you, and the polished executive might be the one who needs saving. Gerald Morrison learned this lesson in the most dramatic way possible. He learned it when everything he had built seemed worthless, when his wealth could not help his daughter, when his status meant nothing in the face of fear. He learned it from people he had dismissed without a second thought, and he was wise enough to let the lesson change him. Not everyone is so fortunate. Not everyone gets a second chance to see clearly. Not everyone encounters angels in leather jackets on their worst night. But perhaps that is why stories like this matter. Perhaps that is why we share them. Because even if we never experience a transformation as dramatic as Gerald's, we can still learn from his journey. We can still choose to look past appearances. We can still decide to tear down our own walls before crisis forces us to. The bikers of the Iron Brotherhood do not consider themselves heroes. They do not seek recognition or praise. They simply live according to a code. Help where you can, protect those who cannot protect themselves, and never judge a person by their exterior. It is a code that sounds simple. It is a code that is remarkably rare. In a world that often rewards selfishness and celebrates division, the Iron Brotherhood stands as quiet testimony to another way of being. They do not preach or proselytize. They just show up, day after day, ride after ride, and sometimes on a desperate night their path crosses with someone who needed them. Gerald Morrison needed them. He did not know it when he walked into the iron saddle, too terrified to care about social boundaries. He did not know it when he climbed onto the back of Maria's motorcycle, placing his life in the hands of a stranger. But he knows it now. He knows it every time he sees Samuel at a foundation meeting, every time Maria texts him pictures from a charity ride, every time Jake drops by his office just to check in. He knows it every time he looks at his daughter and realizes how close he came to losing her, and how strangers became family in the space of one impossible night. The world will always have walls. People will always build them, will always mistake them for reality, will always use them to sort humanity into categories of belonging and exclusion. But the world also has those who tear walls down, who cross boundaries, who show up uninvited and refuse to leave until help has been given. The Iron Brotherhood is one such group. Gerald Morrison became one such person. And perhaps if this story has done its work, you have become one too. Perhaps the next time you see someone who looks different, who belongs to a world that seems foreign, you will remember the businessmen who laughed and the bikers who helped. Perhaps you will choose to see the humanity beneath the surface. Perhaps you will decide that walls are illusions. And perhaps in your own way, you will find the courage to ride through the night for a stranger who needs you. That is the invitation this story offers. That is the challenge it presents. not to become bikers, not to give up your suits or your careers or your comfortable lives, but to remember that comfort can become a cage, that wealth can become a wall, that the person you dismiss today might be the person who saves you tomorrow. Gerald Morrison will carry the lessons of that night for the rest of his life. He will tell the story to his grandchildren. He will ensure that Emma's children grow up knowing that family is not defined by blood, but by who shows up when you need them. The Iron Brotherhood will continue their quiet work. Samuel will keep riding until his body no longer allows it. Maria will keep braiding her silver hair and offering helmets to terrified passengers. Jake will keep his hand on the throttle and his heart open to strangers. These are not exceptional people. They are ordinary humans who made extraordinary choices. The world is full of such people, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look past the leather and the patches and the motorcycles. They are in every community, every neighborhood, every bar and church and workplace. They are waiting to help. They are ready to ride. The only question is whether we have eyes to see them. Gerald Morrison finally does. And now, perhaps, so do you. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for allowing this story into your heart. The businessmen laughed at the biker gang. Then the riders showed up uninvited, and everything changed. May your own walls continue to crumble. May your heart remain open to the strangers who need you. May you ride through the darkness for someone else, exactly as they would ride for you. This is not the end of a story. It is an invitation to begin your own. The road is waiting.